You're sitting at a table right now, maybe literally, maybe just in your memory, surrounded by people who know you, people who think they know you. Plates clinking, someone laughing too loud, the conversation moving on autopilot. And then it happens. Someone looks at you with a casual smile and asks, "So, when are you having kids?" You already know this moment. Your body reacts before your mind does. A small pause, a breath. You smile, maybe out of politeness, maybe out of habit, and you say, "Actually, I don't plan to." And suddenly, the air changes. It's subtle, but you feel it. The silence isn't loud, but it's heavy. Someone raises an eyebrow, someone else looks away, and inside your head 1,000 thoughts collide at once. Do I explain myself? Do I joke it off? Do I stay quiet? Do I defend my reasons? Or do I even owe anyone reasons at all? Because in that exact moment, it doesn't feel like you're just answering a question about the future. It feels like you're being evaluated, judged, reduced, as if one sentence somehow says everything about who you are, your maturity, your empathy, your depth, your worth. And maybe what hurts the most isn't what they're thinking, it's the tiny voice that appears inside you asking, "Is there something wrong with me?" Here's the truth most people never tell you. Not wanting children is not a random preference, it's not a phase, it's not a flaw. From a psychological point of view, this choice often reveals something much deeper, a level of self-awareness, emotional regulation, and independent thinking that many people never actually develop. What most people don't realize is that the mind behind this decision is usually far more complex than the stereotypes attached to it. And because society only knows one script for adulthood, anything outside of it gets misunderstood. But by the end of this video, something important is going to shift for you. You may realize there was never anything missing, broken, or delayed about you. You were just listening to yourself, honestly, in a world that rarely does. And once you understand what's really happening in your mind, you'll never hear that question the same way again. People love to say it out loud, or sometimes just imply it with a knowing look. You don't want kids because you're afraid of responsibility. As if this decision came from panic, immaturity, or running away from life. And if you've heard that enough times, a part of you may have wondered, even briefly, what if they're right? But the truth is, fear doesn't sound like clarity. Fear is loud, chaotic, impulsive. What you feel isn't chaos, it's calm. It's a quiet knowing. And what most people don't realize is that knowing your limits is not the same as avoiding life. Think about it this way. If someone goes to the gym and chooses not to lift a weight they know will injure them, we don't call that fear. We call it awareness. We call it intelligence. From a psychological perspective, this is something called realistic self-knowledge. The ability to accurately assess your emotional energy, mental bandwidth, and the kind of life you can sustain without slowly breaking yourself. Psychologically healthy people don't say yes to everything just to prove strength. They know where they thrive and where they slowly disappear. And raising a child isn't a hobby you can quit when it drains you. It's a permanent emotional demand. Recognizing that isn't weakness, it's responsibility at its most honest form. Avoiding something you know would exhaust you, resent you, or disconnect you from yourself isn't cowardice. It's emotional intelligence. It's choosing not to create a life that would require you to constantly betray your own limits. And for many people, this awareness didn't come out of nowhere. It often traces back to childhood. Growing up too fast, being the emotional anchor in the family, taking care of others before you even learned how to take care of yourself. When you've lived that way, you don't romanticize responsibility. You understand its weight. You know exactly what it costs. That's why this choice often comes with a deep respect for autonomy and balance. You're not rejecting commitment. You're refusing to commit to something that would quietly hollow you out. So here's something worth asking yourself, without guilt and without outside noise. What do you genuinely want? Not what you were trained to want, not what was praised, expected, or normalized. Because once you start separating your true desires from inherited expectations, something uncomfortable but powerful begins to surface. And that realization is what most people are never ready to face. At some point, you start to notice the tone people use when you say you don't want children. It's the same tone reserved for teenagers. Patient, condescending, almost amused. It's just a phase, you'll change your mind. As if this decision came from impulse, emotion, or a desire to provoke the world around you. But that interpretation misses something important completely. Because rebellion is reactive, it's loud, it pushes against something just to feel free. What you're doing feels very different. It's quiet, grounded, intentional. And from the outside, that difference is easy to miss. Think of life like a highway with clear signs: study, work, marry, have kids. Most people stay in their lane because it feels safe, familiar, predictable. Now imagine someone calmly signaling, exiting the road, and choosing a different route, not because they're lost, but because they actually looked at the map. From far away, it might look like defiance. In reality, it's navigation. From a psychological perspective, this is cognitive independence. It's the ability to think for yourself even when that thinking creates discomfort, even when it disappoints expectations, even when it means standing alone for a moment. You're not rejecting society, you're refusing to live on autopilot. What most people don't realize is that many traditions continue not because they were consciously chosen, but because they were never questioned. Some people follow paths simply because they inherited them. Others pause, examine the cost, and ask, is this aligned with who I am? And somewhere in that pause, a realization forms. I wasn't rebelling, I was thinking. This kind of thinking isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, but it's powerful. And one way to strengthen it is simple. Write down your reasons for the choices that matter most to you, not to convince others, to remind yourself. Clarity creates boundaries, and boundaries protect your peace. Because once you see how many people are living on borrowed decisions, it becomes impossible to unsee it. And that awareness starts changing how you view everything that comes next. There's a word people reach for very quickly when someone says they don't want children: selfish. As if the decision automatically means putting yourself first and everyone else last. And at first glance, it almost sounds logical. But this is where the conversation usually stops too early. Because there's an invisible layer most people never think to look at. For many people, this choice doesn't come from a lack of care. It comes from too much awareness. Awareness of emotional limits, of the kind of presence a child actually needs. Some people know, deeply and honestly, that they wouldn't be emotionally available in the way they would want a child to experience. And instead of pretending otherwise, they choose not to create a life that would carry that absence. Others look at the world itself, the instability, the pressure, the uncertainty, and they ask uncomfortable questions. What kind of future am I inviting someone into? What kind of suffering might they inherit, not just socially, but emotionally? And for some, there's an even quieter reason: the decision to not pass down pain, to not repeat patterns of neglect, control, or emotional chaos that were normalized growing up. From a psychological perspective, this is long-term ethical thinking. It's caring about consequences that extend far beyond your own needs or desires. It's understanding that creating a life is not just about love. It's about responsibility for another human's entire emotional world. This level of thinking often belongs to people who are deeply empathetic, sensitive to suffering, attuned to how pain moves from one generation to the next. And that sensitivity doesn't disappear just because it isn't visible. Just because a sacrifice is invisible doesn't mean it's not real. Choosing not to have something you could have, for reasons most people will never ask about, can be one of the quietest forms of care there is. So, if your values are misunderstood, if your reasons are simplified or dismissed, it doesn't mean they lack depth. It means they require reflection to be seen. And as you begin to recognize that, another question starts to emerge. How many people are actually aware of the weight of the choices they make without ever stopping to think? There's something people don't like to admit when this topic comes up. The biological instinct is real. The pull to reproduce exists. It's wired into the body. And acknowledging that doesn't weaken your argument, it strengthens it. Because the story isn't about pretending the instinct isn't there, it's about what you do when it shows up. Inside you, there are different forces at work. One part reacts quickly, emotionally, automatically. It pushes urges, attachments, impulses. Another part slows things down. It asks questions. It looks at consequences. It reflects. These parts aren't in conflict, they just have different jobs. Choosing not to follow an instinct doesn't mean it never appeared. It means you noticed it, felt it, and still decided consciously. And that's something you already do in other areas of life. When you resist an unhealthy habit, when you break a pattern you grew up with, when you feel the urge to repeat what's familiar but pause because you know where it leads. This is the realization most people miss. Feeling an instinct doesn't mean you're obligated to obey it. Impulse is information, not a command. From a psychological point of view, the ability to create space between feeling and action is one of the clearest signs of emotional regulation. It's not repression, it's choice. And that choice requires strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but quietly shapes an entire life. When you understand this, something shifts. You stop seeing your decision as denial and start seeing it as mastery. You weren't disconnected from your nature, you were engaged with it. A simple practice can reinforce this. Pause before major emotional decisions. Just a pause. In that space, you reclaim control. That pause is where freedom lives. And once you realize how rarely people pause at all, you begin to notice something unsettling. How many lives are built almost entirely on unexamined impulses? There's a quiet contrast most people never stop to notice. On one side, there are people who have children because it's time, because that's what comes next, because everyone around them is doing it. The decision slides into place almost automatically, wrapped in social approval and applause. On the other side, there are people who stop. They reflect. They imagine the long-term reality, not just the milestone. They ask themselves hard questions about energy, patience, identity, and responsibility. Questions that don't have socially pleasing answers. And instead of rushing past the discomfort, they sit with it. From a psychological perspective, this is what it looks like to live by internal values rather than external validation. It's choosing alignment over applause. It's understanding that some decisions are too permanent to be made out of pressure or momentum. This kind of thinking is deeply connected to emotional maturity, not the performative kind, the quiet kind. The kind that thinks 10, 20 years ahead. The kind that trusts itself enough to disappoint others without collapsing inside. The kind that knows responsibility isn't proven by doing what's expected, but by owning the consequences of your choices fully. And this is where the perception flips. Maturity isn't doing what everyone expects, it's having the courage to choose what you can stand behind when no one is watching. A powerful exercise is to visualize your future honestly, not the version that earns approval, but the one that feels sustainable. Picture different paths, different mornings, different emotional states, and notice which future brings relief instead of tension. Do it without guilt, without pressure. Because once you allow yourself that clarity, a final realization begins to form, and it changes the way you understand not just this decision, but who you are becoming. If there's one thing to take with you after all of this, let it be this. Not wanting children doesn't mean you're broken, cold, immature, or incomplete. It doesn't mean something is missing inside you. It means you listened. It means you reflected. It means you were honest with yourself in a world that often rewards silence over truth. Human beings are not meant to want the same things at the same time in the same way. There is no single blueprint for a meaningful life. Some paths are loud and celebrated. Others are quiet and deeply intentional. Both are valid. What matters is not the choice itself, but whether the choice is truly yours. And maybe that's where judgment begins to soften. When you realize that many people aren't choosing differently because they're wiser, they're choosing differently because they never paused long enough to ask. That understanding opens space for compassion for others, and more importantly, compassion for yourself. Understanding yourself deeply is one of the most responsible things you can do. It shapes every decision that follows. It protects you from resentment. It allows you to build a life that feels steady instead of performative. So, if any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, if you found yourself nodding in silence thinking, "This is literally me," know this. You're not alone, and you're not late. You're not wrong. You're just conscious. If this video helped you see yourself more clearly, consider staying connected. Like, subscribe, share it with someone who might need to hear this but doesn't have the words yet. Not out of obligation, out of recognition. Take a breath, trust what you know about yourself, and move forward with calm, clarity, and control.